savor, like my hometown that I favor. That old place down the long road that I'm traveling to. There's the jokes at the barber, told by Cleve from the hardware, about the stories that always make the news. Our town, wherever I may roam, I'll always have a place that I call home. Our town, it's very plain to see, there'll always be a part of you in me.
Along Heritage Highway 2 near Kingston is the town of Napanee, a community whose origins date back to the arrival of Loyalists in the 1700s.
Hello, I'm Barry Penhale. This magnificent home, the McPherson House, was built around 1826 on the banks of the Napanee River, where our story begins. The owner, Alan McPherson, known as the Laird of Napanee, was a man who took his politics seriously. Many of his house guests were prominent Tories of their time. In this episode of Sketches of Our Town, we will discover some of Ontario's earliest history.
The signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 marked the end of the American Revolution. Britain ceded her interest to the newly formed United States, and the decision was made to evacuate the remaining British Loyalists still in New York City. With over 40,000 already bound for Nova Scotia or the West Indies, it was decided that the remaining Loyalists would settle on land west of Montreal. On the north shore of Lake Ontario, in the townships of Ernestown, Fredericksburg, Adolphustown, and Marysburg, the settlers began clearing the land for farming, land almost impenetrable with primeval forests. When crops were first being harvested, the lack of a grist milling facility became obvious, as the mill at Kingston Mills was alone in serving such a wide region. Two factors of importance attracted settlement to this site. The Napanee River was ideal for power to drive grist and sawmills, and it was also a shipping route through the Bay of Quinte to outside markets. This was the nucleus of industry that led to the formation of Napanee. The harbor boomed as products from the mills and the land were exported, and coal and manufactured items were imported. The paintings of Orville C. Madden have left us with a vivid account of activity in the community during the late 1800s. Depicted is a time in Napanee's history when schooners and steamboats were the chief mode of long-distance travel. The sprawling area of 1,100 square miles of Lennox and Addington County gradually opened up as settlement pushed higher into the Shield. Though thin thin soil and limestone bedrock was hardly the best for farming, a portion of the land did produce bumper crops of wheat, barley, and dairy products. By 1860, Napanee had become the county seat and a prosperous farming community. The market square and town hall were constantly a ruckus with buying and selling. The population from the surrounding county a ready audience for the politicians of the day. An importing business that commenced in 1854, the Daily Tea Company continued until the 1960s. The product became known throughout Canada. The Daly brothers, founders of the company, performed the tea tasting themselves, sampling and mixing their own blends. The coming of the Grand Trunk Railway 2 years later found Napanee on the Montreal-Toronto line and gave the community new impetus for growth. The availability of rail, water, and road transportation, coupled with water power, put the town on the map and ensured future prosperity. The early story of Napanee is evident throughout the community today. Grace of design was an essential part of the architectural vocabulary, evident in buildings like this sandstone post office constructed in 1891, and its classical style town hall. In 1976, the townspeople stood behind their sense of heritage when the decision was made to restore rather than replace this handsome structure. As a county seat, the town enjoys the presence of such buildings as the courthouse and jail. Constructed in 1864, they were built entirely of local limestone. Today, the jail is home to the County Museum. The County Registry Office, built in 1872, is another example of the community's commitment to preservation. All three buildings occupy a park-like setting and form an integral link to Napanee's past. The central focus in town is the Napanee River, once the scene of violent confrontations between lumbermen and mill owners over the control of its flow. Along its banks is the McPherson House. Here, I met with Helen Hutchinson, who recounted some of the intriguing events associated with the home. Can you describe what you know of the McPhersons who lived in this house?
Yes, Alan McPherson was the son of Lieutenant Colonel Donald McPherson, and he came to Napanee, and he came sometime around 1812 and rented the mill, and then he prospered. He had great ambitions, and he started renting the mill. Then he owned both the sawmill and the grist mill. He also built a distillery. He had a store, and it would be one of the first large stores in Napanee. And we think that Alan built his large house here about 1826. At that time, very few people were able to have a grand house or a mansion, as this has been called. And architecture is outstanding for that period of time. I think it's an established fact that William Gibbard was one of the carpenters who worked on this house. So that may account for some of the elaborate trim that is in the house. And the house was a center, a social center of social gatherings at the time, that it was at its best. And important people were entertained here, such as Bishop Strawn. And then there was another very important figure who was often here as a member of the family. When he was 18 years old, young John Alexander MacDonald's boss in Kingston, George Mackenzie, sent him to Napanee, or across the river, actually, in Clark's Mills, to set up an office. He was a relative, although not a blood relative, of Ellen McPherson. John Alexander was family, and he was taken into the bosom of the family. And not only was he here a great deal at the time that he was an apprentice in Clarkville, but he wrote a farce called The Knights of the Red Cow, and he put it on in this house, in the ballroom, in the Christmas season of 1832. And Johnny was also, he made use of the McPhersons later on when he went into politics. The McPhersons were a great help to Sir Johnny during his political lifetime.
The town that he once called home, Napanee, held a special place in the heart of Sir John A. Macdonald, father of Confederation. The passing trains of the Montreal-Toronto line are a part of everyday life in Napanee. The view of the waterfalls below the Triple Arch stone overpass is among the picturesque scenes noted in Via Rail's promotional literature. In the age of feverish railway construction, competition among the communities vying for the railway was fierce. Two expressions originating at that time are still in use today. If a town was successful in their efforts to attract the railway, they were on the right track, and those that were bypassed considered themselves railroaded. Much of the history of Lennox and Addington County is preserved at the County Museum. Researching a community's past is a labor of love for me. One aspect of Napanee's history that caught my interest was the formation of the town's newspaper, the Napanee Beaver. To find out more about it, I met with Jean Morrison.
I was wondering, Jean, can you tell me something about the origin of the newspaper that you are now the publisher of? How did the Napanee Beaver get underway? When was it started and by whom?
Well, I understand that it was established in 1870, but I believe it was started in Newburgh, and then it was moved to Napanee later and was called the Napanee Beaver. I believe originally, too, it was called the Addington Beaver, but there were many newspapers started, and very many of them didn't last very long.
But the Beaver was here to stay.
That's right.
Yeah. And the founders of the Beaver, who were they?
Well, Cephas Beeman really started it, and then he worked with William Templeton. And William Templeton kept on with the Beaver, and his family ran the Beaver for years until we purchased it in 1953. Mr. Templeton, the original Mr. Templeton, was a printer. Most newspapers had a printing department and a newspaper. Most of them actually were really printers and just carried on the newspaper to fill up their day and to help pay for the expenses. But in general, that's what they always did, had a printing plant as well as a newspaper. Very many of the newspapers were started for political reasons, so in that case, that was the main reason for having a newspaper.
What does it mean to you, Jean, to be the publisher of the Napanee Beaver? I'm sure it's a position of great responsibility.
Well, I certainly feel that it's a very important part of the community. And I don't know which comes first, whether if you have a good newspaper, you have a good town, or if you have a good town, therefore you have a good newspaper. But you often see if you have a very poor newspaper, the town itself is not very progressive and it isn't doing very well. Yes, I take the role of the newspaper very seriously. And we try to give the community all the news that they could possibly wish for, try to cover all events, and just generally do the best job we can. You know the people in the community, you meet them on the street, and if there's anything that's controversial or if you've made mistakes, which we do, you certainly hear about it. And I think it's much more immediate, which is good. I think it's much more interesting, I would say, than working on a city paper.
Is it still done the old way that people come in and put their money down and buy the paper right over the counter?
If you would come in on Wednesday morning, you would just be amazed, because if we're a little late coming out, people are standing in lines up. And you know, that makes you feel really good to realize that they're really waiting for that paper. They have to get their fix for the week.
The town has maintained many traditions in the more than 150 years since its inception. Entrepreneurs that envisioned opportunities were for the most part successful when they acted on their dreams. One such individual, born at nearby Newburgh, arrived in the community in the early 1800s and began an enterprise that evolved into an industrial legacy. Bruce McPherson spoke to me of the story of Gibbard Furniture.
John Gibbard was the founder of Barrie in 1835. He leased a small mill on the canal, which was part of the Napanee Falls and River, in that year. And there were 4 generations of Gibbards, William Gibbard, George Gibbard, and Ernie Gibbard that succeeded John. John lived to be a great old age of 96. In those years, those early years, of course, he made fanning mills and actually small items that was really custom work and delivered in the immediate area. Also, in those years, the funeral business was very much a part of a furniture company, and John Gibbard and his son William after him made, not only operated a funeral parlor, but made many of the products that were allied to that particular type of business. They made coffins, and you'll see some of the old ads where they had shrouds on hand and would provide a hearse if necessary. So the Gibbards were in the company until 1940, and at that time, my dad, Jack McPherson, who had been associated with George Gibbard in earlier years as sales manager and then general manager, bought the company, and there was a complete reorganization took place at that time. We have what some people refer to, I guess, as a family tradition. There are many brothers and fathers and sons that have worked in the company and still work in the company. We're quite proud of the people that we've had over the years. I figure I'm very, very fortunate, the good people that we've had over the years. And I think the figure from 1944 to 1984 of those that have retired during that period is about 48 that worked with the company over 50 years. So it is quite a record. And Fortunately, today we still don't have too many people leave. Quality isn't something you just say you're going to make. You have to. It's an everyday thing, and you've got to have great teamwork, which I feel we have, and the desire and pride. The pride really is what I think is mandatory as far as quality is concerned. But we start right out in the lumber yard. Lumber's got to be dried properly. It's got to be piled properly to be dried properly, and it's got to be dried properly to be properly machined. So it's up to each, in our operation, it's up to each individual department to do their very best for the next department. What we're making today, our line today, is 80% solids, solid mahogany and solid cherry. The mahogany comes from Brazil. It's a type of Honduras mahogany. It's the finest mahogany that we can buy. The Latin term is Microphyllac sapilla, and it's only grown in 3 different areas. Our cherry, we buy as much as we can in Canada and the rest in the U.S. It's becoming increasingly difficult to purchase. The other interior woods that we use for inside the cabinets we buy in Canada. Well, Napanee means I guess almost as much as Gibbard, Barry. I was born here, and other than about 8 years when I lived in Montreal, and during the wartime, I've lived here. My roots are here, and I think it's just the greatest little community. And the location is just a nice size, and so Napanee means an awful lot to me in this company, and that's why we advertise Gibbard of Napanee.
My visit to this community has given me a glimpse into the past of a town whose beginnings were etched from the rock and forest of the Precambrian Shield. Today, the Napanee, as the town was known in early times, owes much to the pioneering people whose perseverance and vision helped to make this a special place.
I'll see the folks up on Main Street who will always take the time for a story over coffee at the old Five and Dime. The flag on our town hall through the years has flown free, a tribute to our hometown's history. Our town, wherever I may roam, I'll always have a place that I call home. Our town, it's very plain to see, there'll always be a part of you in me. There'll always be a part